Hey guys, and welcome back to the channel. Today I have a very exciting guest for you. Today I interview Mubin. Mubin is the CTO and co-founder of a company called Navi Medical Technologies. Mubin arrived in Australia as an international student to study a Masters of Biomedical Engineering. While Mubin was at university, he was part of a group that co-founded Navi Medical Technologies. We're going to talk about Mubin's story on how he studied in Karachi, Pakistan, what it was like to come to Australia as an international student, and what it's like to found a company and the challenges they face trying to raise funds during a pandemic, and the advice that he has for every entrepreneur. So please stay tuned. Like always, if you find this video useful, like, subscribe, leave a comment, and tell me who you want me to interview next. So Mubin, first of all, welcome to my podcast. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me. I know you've been extremely busy. Now, throughout this podcast, I want everyone to get to know you a little bit. So I won't actually do a detailed introduction, and I'm hoping as part of this, we will get to know you a little bit better. So let's start off with Mubin. Who are you? Where did you study? What school did you go to? Where did you go to school? And start with that.
Yes. I'm going to first tell you that I'm not originally from Australia. I was an international
Okay.
student here. I did my master's degree. So I did my undergrad degree and everything before it back in Pakistan. So I'm from a city called Karachi, which is like the southern part of, it is situated in the southern part of Pakistan. And when I guess when I was young, my father is a doctor. He used to administer a big hospital in Karachi. I used to visit the hospital just because he was there and, to get to meet him. But at the same time, I would look at the hospitals. I would see so many issues with how the current system was run. And when I say issues, it was basically my dad explaining all the problems they had in their hospital. And they're like, if you had, better technology, if you had access to better resources, this could have been so much better. So that was sort of the seed that he planted within me that, if I want to go forward if I want to do something in the medical side, sort of follow the legacy that my father is leaving, like the medical legacy, I could, look into doing something like that. So that's how I sort of started thinking about the biomedical engineering pathway, which I'll talk about in a minute. But like I said, my high school was done in Karachi. After graduation from the high school, I think I went back forth a lot between my parents and my uncle, who's actually an engineer. He's a mechanical engineer. He works in Dubai. And we were trying to figure out that if I want to follow engineering, which was one of the things that I was interested in, how can I combine it with the medical side of things? And this is how I learned about biomedical engineering. And interestingly, the university that was actually the best university in our city was had sort of this biomedical engineering course starting. They had already started it a few years ago, but it was relatively new compared to the other fields, like mechanical and electrical engineering. So it's sort of like all the stars aligned together for me to get into that field. And, that's how I got into my undergrad. The university that I studied in Karachi is called NED, University of Engineering and Technology. I did a bachelor's of biomedical engineering there. And it was a 4 to 5 year program with the last bit had a 6 month placement. Now, the course itself was really, really geared towards research and development. Like they were trying to teach you some part of the
Yeah.
research, but a lot of the part of development. So there were a lot of opportunities for us to actually build things. And I'm happy to talk more about it later if we get to that. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Can I
but
just wind back a little
yes.
bit? So you got into sort of biomed in Karachi. Now, just tell me a little bit about that process of actually getting into university over in Karachi. So just as a context, in Australia, we have these final year exams in year 12. Everyone has to get ranked on a score, and then they put in their first, second, and third preference. Now, in Australia, people think that if you don't get the marks that you need to get into university, it's kind of the end of the world. But in reality, there's other pathways. What's that process like over in Pakistan?
Yes, it depends. It actually depends on which university you're going, right? So there are a few top universities, few top engineering universities in Pakistan. The one that I went to is actually a semi-private or a semi-government funded university. And then there are others that are top, but they're all completely private. Now, the thing with the private universities is they mostly assess if you can get in based on a standard test that they do once you
Yeah.
graduate. They don't really care much about your high school scores. So you just need to, have a minimum threshold like 50% if you can get in your high school and you could get into that. But this semi-government one, what it does, it does that test as well, but it doesn't really weight your assessment towards the test. What it does basically, it looks at the three courses that you did in your high school, physics, math, and chemistry, and then ranks all the candidates who passed the test with a 40%
Yeah.
based on, those scores. And what actually ends up happening is that because they have like 18 to 19 disciplines that they offer, the top ones sort of get to pick from everything that's available. And as soon as,
Right.
the disciplines and their quotas gets filled, the ones that are, under them sort of gets less and less choices. So I was at a fairly good spot. I had pretty much access to every field, maybe once or twice that like it might have been the petroleum engineering or electronics engineering that I couldn't get.
Yeah.
But the biomedical one, because it was relatively new, no one was, going towards it, but I still
Right.
jumped towards it, and that's how it all happened. Yeah.
That's really interesting, actually. So no one, in terms of biomedical engineering, it was relatively new. You were saying incorrect. How long? How many years was that around for?
Think for that particular university, it might have been in the industry for about 3 years, might have been three
Okay.
to 4 years from memory.
Yep.
There have been other universities that offered that course, but I don't think the university that I went to, NED, they didn't have it for longer than 3 years. Yeah.
If you in that system, if you don't get into the courses that you want to get into, is there still another way? Is there other avenues to get into those courses as well? So if you get into a similar course in a university, can you also transfer through to the kind of courses that you want to if you meet certain hurdles like grades and things like that?
Yes, so there are two particular pathways that you can use to actually get into a course that you couldn't get with your own merit. One is the self-finance pathway. So as I said, it's
Yeah.
a semi-government funded university, right? So we basically paid $100 a year for the tuition fee. It's because
Yeah.
the government funds it, right?
Yeah.
But there was a self-finance pathway where if you pay like I think I net $4,000 a year. And because I'm comparing Pakistani currency to the Australian, it sounds
Yes.
cheap, but it's not actually cheap. If you pay like three to $4,000 a year, you get into the self-finance pathway, and the
Right.
self-finance pathway has its own sort of merit list. So obviously there'll be less people in that, so you might be at a higher level.
Right. Gotcha. So there's effectively two pools that you can apply for. You can go for the self-funded pathway, and because that pool's a little bit smaller, because it's actually quite an expensive pathway, there's a little bit less competition. But of course, like you were saying, it's quite expensive.
Yes, and the other one that I was going to talk about is actually if you get really good grades in your first year, you have the chance to jump over to another
Right.
discipline.
Perfect.
Yeah, but I think to do that, I think there needs to be some students that have actually left the other course, which happens pretty much in every
Right.
discipline. So there's always an
Yeah.
opportunity for you to jump because there's always dropouts.
Correct. That's a really interesting insight because sometimes, especially I know when I was younger as well, and in terms of grades, I didn't probably necessarily have the greatest grades, but I did get into a university. But at universities, towards certain areas, I actually really excelled as well. So there is also that opportunity in that system as well, and same especially in Australia as well. You can get in, get better grades, and like you were saying, there's always people that drop out, and people in those later years of high school don't necessarily know exactly what they want to do, and they kind of change what they're doing. So that's a great insight. So continuing on from that, so you've gotten into university, you've kind of picked a field based on sort of two equal and opposing forces. You've got engineering and you've got medicine on one side. What was it like in university in Karachi itself?
Yes. and I'll try to make it as relevant as possible to the people who are in Australia. I know this is
Yeah,
more of a Pakistani story, but I'll make sure that there is some
mate.
relevancy there.
And just to clear, we also go for international student. I'm hoping my audience appeals to international students as well. So make it as relevant as possible to international students as well. It's really important.
Yep. Okay. So, yeah. So I think your question was like, how was how was the field itself, combining
Yeah,
medicine and
absolutely.
sort of engineering, right? So the first few years or the first 2 years that I did, had a lot of prerequisite medical courses that we had to do. So a lot of
Yeah,
courses like physiology, anatomy, biochemistry, all these courses that obviously I hadn't done before. I had done basic biology, but they wanted to sort of raise us up to a point that we were similar to medical students, or not
yeah,
exactly to their level, but at some level, so that we can understand how the bodily systems work. So that was our first and second year. But they also had a lot of engineering courses so that you get an idea of basic electrical engineering, basic mechanical, and all that. I got to tell you one thing about biomedical engineering. Even though it has a big medicine component associated with it, the biomedical engineers, what I would like to call them, are like jack of all and sort of master of none. So you have to actually make
yeah.
yourself a master of something, because they teach you pretty much everything in that field, like every sort of things from different, disciplines. Like you'd be learning courses from mechanical engineering. You'll have, engineering mechanics, strength of materials, fluid
Absolutely.
mechanics, thermodynamics, all that. But then at the same time, you'll be doing electrical engineering courses. You'll be doing software engineering courses. So there's a bunch of these courses that are sort of scattered, that
Yep.
you can take up. But the thing is that they're all basic courses. So if you want to make yourself, really good at a certain discipline, like for example, I was really into electrical and software engineering. What I did
Yep.
was I took up more software engineering courses, and I did a lot of electrical engineering projects myself because I knew the basics. Now I can go out and apply it in the practical field. So just going back to your question, the great thing about the course itself was that we were now looking at the medical problems with a lens of engineering, right? So, like I mentioned before, there are a lot of issues in hospitals that could be solved with engineering skills. But then how do you actually solve it? Like, first step is to actually understand the problem, and, then you see what skills are at your disposal that you can apply to solve it. So if you know mechanical engineering, software engineering, all these different disciplines, you may have a broader range of, or like a bigger basket to select from, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, that makes perfect sense. And I always one of the things that you're really harping on, and I always like to mention this to people as well. Say in Australia you study accounting and you only do accounting. If you've got experience from another field, it may give you another perspective on how to solve that problem specifically as well. So, for example, having that ability that you had for both engineering and medicine gave you, just like you were saying, it's a bigger
I think I
remit
got cut
to
off.
be able
I don't know
to
if you can hear me.
actually solve problems better because you can attack it from both angles, and it will help you come to a more holistic answer, I would say, to a problem, and not just a one directional view on something.
Yep.
The first couple of years, how did you find the work in those first couple of years? Did you find so stepping up from the university days, so the high school days to getting into the university days, did you find that challenge? Like, how long did it take you to adapt to the kind of the different standard that was there?
Yeah. So one of the earlier challenges I had was actually getting the basics of the biology sorted. Like, as I said,
Yeah,
physiology and anatomy. Like, they were great courses, like, but the issue was that because I just did basic biology, it took me a really long time to really get
yeah,
used to the jargons, you get used to the bodily systems. There are so many, like, even in your arm, there's so many bones that have different names. There are metacars, you know, I can't even remember some of the names now, but you have radius and ulna, you have humerus. You need to remember all the names of the bones and everything. That's just one
yeah.
example. But it was just getting used to how the people in medicine sort of adapt and learn these courses. So that was the first challenge. Um, the second challenge was that in the early years, because it was all theoretical, and the practical bit sort of came in a bit later in third and fourth years. I struggled to just figure out the purpose of the course because it was like, oh yeah, I love learning about how the physiology works. I know about the basic electrical stuff, but what do I do with it? It's like I didn't know if you so you must have done some sort of calculus in your engineering
Absolutely.
degree, right?
Yeah.
You read about these all these differentials and integrals, and you're like, okay, I can solve an integral now. I can do double integration. I can understand differentials, but what do I do with it? And it's to the point when you start, applying them to physical problems, to physics. You're understanding, okay, the laws of motions had a lot of these integrations
Absolutely.
and differentials apply. It starts to make sense. It's sort of I had that feeling, and like, what am I going to do with it? So I tried sort of, chatting to a lot of my seniors and teachers to understand what was that. And one of the advice that I consistently got was that yes, it's going to come in, but you shouldn't wait for it, right? So if you've gotten the theoretical knowledge, start applying it somewhere. So, and this is one of the advice that I'll give to some of the students, regardless international or local students, is that
Hmm.
when you're in the university, you, and if you're only focusing towards the theoretical, and if the course doesn't have the practical elements itself, you got to find ways to implement those practical elements. So, for example, in a year, let's say you have 2 semesters. Now, each semester has this small slot of holidays that are associated with it, right? So if you have your, February semester, you'll have January, February, and even December available for you to do something, right? If you have the one after, you'll have, the July period and the June period to do stuff, right? So my advice to some of the students would be that in those slots, you don't waste those slots. You try to either find an internship in any industry, try to get some practical skills through those internships, or what you do is if you're not getting into internships, because I know that there aren't many internships out there, but there are too many students, what do you do is you go online and find DIY projects. So what I did basically was, and I was so interested in building electrical circuits, is that I went online, I wrote ECG DIY. So ECG is electrocardiogram. It's like a device that monitors heart's electrical activity. But there's so many DIY projects available online that you can just build your own. And I know that it's a DIY. It's like it has all the instructions in there, and you're basically following a template. But even then, even that's so helpful because when you start implementing it, you can't implement it 100% the way that they implement it. There's going to be so many gaps that you have to address as well. And then you start thinking about those gaps, and then you start researching those gaps, and then you learn something new. And then when you go on and actually build that circuit, you'll be like, oh, it's not working anymore. What should I do? And then you go out and try to solve that problem. So there are so many opportunities to learn through those. One example that I use for this particular one is that if you read a research paper, you know that the research papers are meant to be written in a way that someone can replicate that research. But when you actually read the papers,
Yeah.
you can't 100% replicate the research because so much assumed knowledge and there's so many gaps, so you have to make assumptions there or contact the author. So that sort of sends you on this rabbit hole of finding out those answers. I think it's very similar to these DIY projects as well. No matter how good the YouTube videos are, no matter how good these blogs are, you are going to get stuck and you will have to go out of your bubble and find that answer, and that's the part where you learn a lot. And next time you're building something, you'll be even quicker. So that's something I'll tell the students of today.
There's a lot to unpack in that, and that's some absolute great advice. So there's three key things that I've got written down here, which I'd love to discuss about what you were just saying. So the first thing is let's talk a little bit about one of those aspects of what you were saying. You came from an engineering, sort of you understand the engineering, you know what motors are, you know what fluid flow and biomechanics and all that sort of stuff is, but you're trying to learn the biology. So I sometimes say when you're taking on a new subject that you've never, it's like learning a new language. You need to, like you were saying, you need to learn the jargon. What was your process in actually learning how to do that? How did you actually go about doing that? Because that's actually quite stressful when you don't even understand the basics of what someone's saying. And you do get embarrassed when you just ask stupid questions. Like if you start a new job and you don't understand the terminology, you do feel a bit you might feel a bit embarrassed or stupid about asking those. So what was your process around that? How did you actually get to learn that and get up to speed as quickly as you did?
In terms of biology, I'll divide that into two sections, the anatomy and the physiology. So anatomy is
Yeah.
basically understanding what different parts are in the body and what are their names. So what are their names that are labeled by scientists of the all. And then you have the physiology, which is just understanding the processes that are happening in the body. So for the anatomy, it's basically memorization. And
Right.
memorization is hard, so you have to write down and remember things. But there are ways
How
online.
stressful was that?
It was quite stressful, but then there are ways to actually get better at remembering names. So sometimes there would be these trying to remember these words that you can just each alphabet of that word would sort of map to a particular bone of the arm, for example.
Right.
So if you remember in trigonometry that you had that some people have curly brown hair, still painted black analogy, where
Yeah.
some means
Okay.
sine, P means perpendicular, H means hypotenuse, and you would know
Absolutely.
that sine is equal to, some people have perpendicular divided by hypotenuse. There are so
Yeah.
many ways to do that in anatomy as well. I can't remember anything from the top of my
That
head, but that's one of the things that actually helped me because if they're funny phrases, I could remember them, and the next time they come up, I'll be like, okay, it's radius ulna, it's humerus, and along those lines. So that's how I sort of tried to work towards the anatomical part. But for physiology, I think physiology was like the process for me to get better at physiology was to first write down all the jargons. So what would happen is that
Mhm.
when you read a book, the book that we were following was a book by a scientist called Sherwood. And when you read the book, when you read the paragraphs, the book was pretty good, but it would repeat the jargon again and again. So I would just try to note those jargons down. And I'm like, okay, if it's gonna come again, I'll exactly know what it means. And it's all the process stuff. So it's very easy to, follow through the process. They're gonna be talking about, okay, what's a cardiac cycle? How does the electrical current in the heart flows? It flows through the SA node, then it goes through the right atrium, then it goes through the muscles, the Purkinje fibers, all that. So those, if I knew all the jargons, if I knew what SA node was, what Purkinje fibers were, and if I know what they're talking about with the diagrams and everything, it would be much easier for me to understand the process. And the other thing that actually helped was you look at the book. Books are helpful, but at the same time, you can look at online resources. There are YouTube videos, so many YouTube videos available that would just dumb it down to, you know, um, to the level where you'd be like, okay, it makes sense.
Absolutely.
It's like ELI 5, like explain like I'm five, kind of thing you would find on YouTube. So that was sort of how I tackled it. I don't know if it's the best way to
That,
do it, but that helped me.
no, no, no. That's a valid point. And again, to everyone listening, when you find a new challenge, you've got and I think the process, if I was to summarize some of that, you've kind of chunked down the work into specific components, and then you've tried to understand the components and then see how they all flow together. And you were saying right at the start as well, in that first phase, that it was actually quite stressful because you don't understand what's happening. But is it safe to say you just persisted through it? It's you set up a process and you just followed the process of how to actually learn to teach yourself. I actually interviewed someone, and they were telling me it took them about 12 months to go through the process of learning how to learn. And I think when you're starting a new challenge, what you're trying to say is you basically got to stay persistent to the problem that you're trying to solve, but you've got to do it in a way that you learn. And the best way to do that is just start doing something. And the process, what I see that you've done is you've just kind of chunked it down. You've learned the components. You've said it in such a way that it made it funny, and then you were able to remember it in such a way it sort of triggers a memory, and you were able to just stick to that until it just became second nature. Is that a good characterization of the way you did
That's right. And look, I'm no genius. I'm not a, prodigy kid or anything. But the way I sort of kept myself motivated and you're talking about persistence, the way it came through was through two things basically. One was basically the fact that I actually wanted to understand the biology so that I can,
right?
solve those problems that I had seen in the hospital way back. So that actually helped a lot. But the second one was I was just super competitive. I was like, I have my
Yeah.
friends. We were all competing against each other. I'm like,
Yeah.
I want to get better grades than them. So that sort of kept
Well,
me motivated.
that's actually a key thing as well. Find a, and I guess you can do competitiveness in a healthy way and an unhealthy way as well. but find a peer group as well. I think that's a critical point. You say find a peer group that have similar qualities. The other thing that you've alluded to as well is and you were saying that you found the problems before you got into biomed. There was a passion there to actually solve a problem, and that's. Do you think that gave you the persistence to follow through? Just having that passion to actually be able to fix a problem, and that's kind of why you were doing it. You weren't doing it for you to get rich or to win awards or anything like that. You actually were trying to do it to solve a problem, but you're also in that peer group where you're kind of actually helping each other, being a little bit competitive. You want to beat your friends in the friendliest, healthiest way.
Yep.
I want to follow up with a second thing that you actually said, and I thought that was absolutely critical. And this is where everyone falls apart. One of the critical things that I always see people do is they study everything. They study the roots, they study the roots, they study the roots, but they don't pick the fruit. And what I mean by pick the fruit is you've got to actually practically apply that. And that key point that you were saying was during those breaks that you have at the end of university, or even even if it's a weekend, look for those internships. I think that's quite key and important, because you really do, and this is for anything that anyone's studying, theory is important, but you can have no theory and be able to apply something, and you'll get a lot further in life than the person who knows all the theory inside out. Those practical examples of actually having to apply for those internships. And some of those, even if you're not getting paid for them, get that experience. It's really worthwhile. And then the second thing that you said, and I can tell that you started your own business, because every single, business owner has told me this: do your own DIY projects. I've actually interviewed a doctor over at Monash Health, and he was telling me, I asked him the question, I said, what do you look for when you're hiring someone? He goes, if they've got no experience, I look for what projects are they working on? What sort of portfolio have they got? So those DIY projects that anybody can do, anyone can do those. They will really show that you stand out in front of people. Interestingly enough, when I got my first job, I had a DIY project that I actually presented in my interview, and that kind of got me across the line and beat the competition. So those are really, really, really key insights. So I could tell that you've come at your profession from a point of passion. You've seen a problem, you've seen an issue. Your dad's obviously given you a bit of encouragement to say, hey, there's a problem with the system right now. You've taken a choice to wanting to fix it, and then you found an avenue into that process to actually fix it. So I think that's really, really, really encouraging. So let's we'll go on a little bit more about your career. We'll fast track a little bit. So you've done your studies, you finished university. How did you, and then you obviously come over to Australia as an international student. How did that process happen? How did you apply for, why Melbourne University out of all places? How did that start?
Yes, so the thing with biomedical engineering in Karachi, and specifically with the course that I did, it had a lot of research and development aspects, as I was alluding to earlier, but there weren't any jobs out there that would actually use people with those skills, right? So what we were learning was really based on an international standard. Like they actually adapted it from, I think, one of the universities in the US, might have been MIT. They adopted a lot of those courses from there. But those courses were suitable if you were in MIT itself, or if you're in American market, and you have the industry actually hiring for those people. What the case in Karachi was, I don't think I know any research and development companies or any industries that are actually building medical devices, and I can see now why. But at that point, the only jobs available to you would be either you become a salesman, so you need like a product specialist.
Right.
So if you're learning about medical devices in a degree, you would know about it, and you can then use that knowledge to sell the device and teach people how to use it. So that was one avenue. The other one was servicing. So you could work as a hospital biomedical engineering in the hospital biomedical engineering department, and you can fix the machines there. So I mean that attracts a lot of people as well, because you're still going through the process of troubleshooting, diagnosing the problem, and then coming up with a solution. But I don't think that was for me. That was for me. The third option was that you get into teaching. So teaching, obviously, it's just you teach what you learn. So what happened with me was that I was convinced that I don't want to stay here because I don't see growth in what I actually want to do. So I started
Yep.
looking for opportunities overseas, and in
Was that
Australia,
scary?
oh, it
Did
was
that
very
scare you
scary.
going? Yeah, I was gonna say, what was that? What's the feeling like? Because you're going to another country, and again, your English is perfect, but the way you learn English and the way you speak English in Australia is very different. That's one thing I speak to a lot of people for, and a lot of people who are very fluent in, I would say, correct English, come to Australia and learn the way that we speak English, and find it very difficult. So, what were the emotions behind all of that? How did you find that?
Yeah, it was quite challenging. I had a lot of challenges when I came here. There was a bit of a cultural gap, the language gap, and the
Yeah,
accent. Like I was used to the American and British accent, and the Australian accent was like totally out of the world for me. It took me a while to get used to it, and even now, sometimes I go to the northern side of Australia and I meet people I still struggle sometimes to understand. But I've gotten used to it. But anyways, just taking a step back. Yes, it was a challenging process, but like I said, I think for me it was sort of set in stone that I want to do something meaningful. I want to
yeah,
impact people's life. And how can I impact it? I don't think it was by repairing machines or selling the product, but for me
right.
it was by building it. So I was motivated to find a university overseas where I can do a master's degree and then use that to accelerate my career. And the way I sort of came across University of Melbourne was because of some of the great work that has been done here in the past 10 to 20 years, or actually even more, dating back to, I think, probably 70s, 80s, I don't remember. But I looked at the bionic ear, the bionic eye. Um, Cool things really attracted me. As a young engineer,
Yeah,
I'm like the notion of actually building something like that really attracted me. And then, the cochlear implant that you have a company
absolutely.
in Sydney that sells cochlear implants. That sort of also came through, I think, through a professor at the University of Melbourne. So a lot of these inventions and a lot of these technologies that came through Australia sort of, attracted me towards that. I also considered going to the US, but I guess the reason that I didn't end up going to the US was because I found that the quality of life in Australia was way better
It's very
compared to
high.
the
Yeah,
the crime
we're
rate.
very
And
lucky here.
yes, there are a lot of good things in Australia that
Well,
I
we're glad
that
you're
I'm
here.
yeah, thank you so much. But I think I got a bit spooked with when I was talking to some of my friends in the US who had already gone there.
Yep.
Yeah, so that's how I decided to come to Australia. Multiple reasons. Yeah.
That's very interesting and very brave of you to, and again, being Asian of Asian descent, myself, leaving the family is actually a big thing. So leaving the family and going to another country where the language is, let's say, not really that English, is a big challenge. And how much time did it take you to sort of get used to that, to the cultural difference? Do you think it took about 6 months, a year to sort of adjust to the way we say g'day and how are you? And
I think it took me a couple of years to get used to
yeah,
all the
it's
jargon. I would say that I'm still not on top of it. Sometimes, like I said before, sometimes I
all
still
right.
get confused over things. Sometimes, so there are these cultural subtleties, like the nuances that when you're meeting someone. I'll give you an example, right? So
Yep,
in Karachi, when you meet a friend after a very long time, the way you go about it is, you hug them first and then you shake
yep,
hands. I found that with
right.
some of my colleagues here, if you meet them after a while, they'll shake your hand first and sorry, yeah, they'll shake your hand first and then they'll hug you. And what I would
Yep,
do, just subconsciously, so I'll shake their hand, hug them, and then I'll put my hand again for it to shake. And I'm like, oops, sorry, gotta put it back. So these are these small things that I'm still, getting used to and sort of losing the muscle memory that I had from before. Um,
absolutely.
yeah, but it's still taking me time, and but I think it took me a couple of years to actually really get used to the accent and really understand what the teachers were talking about when I was, doing my degree.
And that's a challenge too, because it's not a cheap process to study at Melbourne Uni out of all places, as well as an international student. Um, but because I think you just talk to me a little bit about that, because that would have been really hard. you're paying a lot of money to study at Melbourne University. It's not cheap. We all know it's not cheap. That, but then the language is a little bit hard to understand. It's not necessarily the content; it's just the way it's expressed. How do you find the strength to kind of work through that, not just go back to Pakistan and I don't know, be a salesperson or fix machines. But it is actually I speak to a lot of migrants as well. My parent, I'm a first generation migrant here. My parents are, and they, when we came here, it's a very, very welcoming country. That's one thing. But we did struggle. I think I never spoke English when I first went to school as well. And not that I remember that, but my parents did say, you did take a bit of stress with that. But what was it like for you? What was that? How did you cope? How did you persist? How did you push through? What did you do? What were the things that you did every day?
I think the main thing, obviously, aside from the passion to actually do good in my field and grow, one of the other things that sort of gave me the strength and kept me going was the fact that Melbourne is a very diverse place. It's very multicultural.
Yes.
You're
Yes.
not alone here in this kind of situation, right? So when you come to Melbourne University, there's a bunch of international students that are in the same boat as you. So you make friends with them and you sort of see the challenges that you're facing and then see the challenges that they're facing, and then you sort of build that chemistry, and then it's like if you're trying to solve a problem alone, you'd feel very burdened. But if you have multiple people that are helping you and are in the same sort of boat, the burden sort of gets distributed, and it's pretty hard to explain. But it's like there's this Indian movie where this guy says a quote. They see this result. These three friends, and they two of them fail, and the third one sort of gets a pretty good grade. But then in the end, they say that it would have been so much better if we all failed, because then we'd be all in the same boat and we'd feel less
Yeah.
bad about it. It's kind of like that when you have people surrounding you facing the same challenges. I think it's much easier to tackle them. So that
Absolutely.
yeah, so that's one of the reasons why I was able to sort of move through that, and the diversity, like I said, and the multiculturalness here really helps.
Absolutely. And it's interesting. And I'll circle back to something you said earlier as well. You know how you had that peer group when you were in university and you were sort of competing and trying to, you're a bit competitive, you want to beat your friends and all that. It's a little bit like that. You found community in a group of people that share a similar sort of share the similar issues, and then you kind of work through those problems together. And being Melbourne, of course, it's a very multicultural community that we have here. Everyone's quite welcoming. I felt very welcome coming to this country as well. So I think that whole being able to find community where you're struggling in life, to summarize that a little bit, try and find people who have similar sort of struggles and work with each other to kind of improve those situations that you're in. And if you keep at it and you keep persistent to it, you will get through that. Like that problem will get solved, and you'll have another problem to solve. And then follow that same process, find community, work with other people to get through that process. So I think that is a great absolute insight. So I think we've gone a little bit over the 30 minutes about your career side of it, but you've obviously been quite successful at Melbourne Uni. You were successful, in your studies in Pakistan as well. After university, I see that you've actually come out. You've done some research as well. But the one thing I'm absolutely dying to get into. Tell me a little bit about Navi. How did what is Navi? How did it start, and when did it start? Start with that.
Yes, so Navi Medical Technologies is a pediatric-based medical device company. We're Melbourne-based, basically, but we build devices to improve care for
Yep.
sick children all around the world. That's sort of our motto. Actually, the exact words would be creating brighter and healthier future for children around the world. That's our goal.
Absolutely.
So 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 at Navi, we build medical devices to solve a lot of fit for purpose medical devices to solve a lot of the problems that we find in the children's hospitals and in the women's hospitals. And the problem that we're solving at the moment is is actually helping doctors place central venous line in premature babies and older children, so that the drug delivery is quicker and the whole process is efficient. Um, so how did Navi come together? Okay, so this is actually quite
What year did
interesting
it come
because
together?
it came together in
Yeah.
2016, and it came together
Yep.
through a course at the University of Melbourne called Biodesign Innovation. So it actually came through a course itself, and it wasn't like, we sort of I sort of put in a Gumtree ad and found 5 founders through that. It was more like, we met through a course and went through that.
Tell me more about how you all came together. So you came together in the course, and how did Navi start from that?
Yes, so like I said, it was through a course called Biodesign Innovation. Now the purpose of the course, and the course was interestingly introduced in the same year that I did it. The purpose of the course was to bring together a cohort of engineering student, biomedical engineering master student, and a
Yep.
cohort of students that were doing an MBA. So students from School of Engineering, students of from the Melbourne Business School, and pair them with a bunch of clinicians that were really active in the in the medical device innovation field in Melbourne itself, right? So the purpose of the course was that you would then go out to different hospitals, different clinics, talk to doctors, nurses, patients, and sort of get a list of needs and problems that they're facing
Yep.
in their domain. And this would be either through interviews, through observing them when they were doing their procedures, talking to patients, and all that. And then, you would select one problem that you're really passionate about, or, you think that you really want to work towards, or has a big market, or has a big impact, or, can be worked towards in that time frame. It was a 1 year course. And then you sort of find a solution to that problem and then sort of present a business case. That's why you had MBA. So it was like sort of a mini startup simulation in that course. Now, the great thing that happened through that course was we actually did find a lot of real world problems that needed solving, right? And for personally, I've seen a
Yeah.
lot of problems in Pakistani hospitals, but when I came here, I saw Royal Women's, Royal Melbourne Hospital, and I thought, these are quite advanced hospitals. There wouldn't be a lot of problems here. But when you actually go into the setting itself, you talk to the doctors and you see them, you'll be like, we could easily come up with like 10 to 20 different problems just in one session. And I'm like, we're in 2017 and there's still, sorry, 2016, and there's still a lot of problems that haven't been solved. Um, so the problem that we're solving now as part of the startup actually came through that course, and the team that I met is actually came through that course as well. So it's quite interesting, yeah.
It's interesting you mentioned that because I was doing some research and I was looking at some of the stuff that on your website as well. So let's just look at the problem that you're actually trying to solve now with the neonatal catheters.
Yep.
Um, Tell us a little bit about right now, if you want to put a catheter in a neonatal kid, tell me, is it just an adult catheter that they use right now? And it's not specifically designed for kids themselves?
No, it's not that. Like they're actually designed for kids. They're
Okay.
very tiny catheters that could go into the vessel. I think
Okay.
what the website might be trying to say is that there are a lot of devices in the market that are only suited for um, adult sort of population and not
Right.
newborns and pediatrics because it's such a small portion of the market, right? So FDA had this survey done, I think in 2021 or 2020, I remember, and they found out that only 10% of all the devices that they approve are for pediatrics, and only 5% of those for newborn. So you can see that the disparity,
Right.
right? Like there's so less of
Right.
the devices, and a lot of the devices that get used in the pediatrics are sort of the ones that were built for adults, and they're sort of trying to fit it on pediatrics until someone comes in and
Yep.
makes it very specific to them. So I
Gotcha.
think that was the message. The catheters that we deal with are not necessarily um, under that sort of problem. And we're not building the catheters as well, right? So the current problem that we're trying to solve is actually placement of the
Hmm.
catheter and actually monitoring as once it's actually placed within the body. So catheters
Absolutely.
are basically so catheters are basically your thin, flexible tubes that are they're basically feeding tubes, right? So for premature babies, they're either inserted through their arms or through their
Absolutely.
umbilical vein, and the purpose of the catheter is to actually place them just below the heart or above the heart if you're coming from the arm, and what it does is basically it creates an opening from outside to inside so that doctors can deliver important drugs and nutrition to keep the baby alive and keep them healthy until they can be out of the ICU, right? Now the issue with this procedure is that it's done blindly.
Absolutely. Now, in terms of the catheters themselves, it says basically on your website, I think it's 40% of them are misplaced when they're inserted, and the second thing is even when they're put in the right place, 50% of them migrate. So prior to your device, how do we actually try and correct that issue right now?
At the moment, so at the moment, the misplacement rate is due to the fact that there is no way of knowing where the catheter tip is in real time. So the basic process is that
Absolutely.
the clinicians will do a calculation of the catheter. They'll look at the patient's body and they'll try to estimate how much the catheter should go in, so sort of estimate the insertion depth, and then they'll place it,
Yeah.
and they'll try to navigate it based on haptic feedback, which is not very reliable. And then what they'll do is they'll call for an X-ray that could take 5 minutes to an hour, depending on the time of the day, if it's for newborn babies. And when it comes in, if it's not right, if it's not in the right spot, then sometimes they actually have to remove the whole kit, and it's not sterile anymore. So they have to bring in a new kit and redo the procedure. So that takes a lot of time and creates a lot of frustration from the clinician. So that's the placement of the catheter, where we talked about misplacement.
Right.
Then you talked about the monitoring aspect of it. So what happens is that once they sort of get it in the right spot in the second and third try, and then they confirm it with the X-ray, what happens is that the catheter can actually migrate to a suboptimal position without you actually knowing that it has
Yep.
migrated. And if it migrates, for example, too high into the heart, it can start delivering drugs to that undesirable location and could cause issues like cardiac tamponade or issues where the heart's outer layer sort of,
Right.
inflates, and, it can become really, really dangerous for the baby. There is currently no way for the clinicians to pick that up unless they do an X-ray every day. But then if they do an X-ray every day, then you're bombarding them with ionizing radiations, and X-ray has its own problems. So, so
That's
that this is where we come in, basically.
that's exactly what I'm trying to say. So the problem is that effectively it's hard to we kind of estimate where they get placed, and then secondly, if they move, we really can't determine that it's moved, and it could potentially deliver the drugs to the wrong location of where the intended target is. Now, what are the actual consequences of that happening? Because the solution that you've come up with is actually quite ingenious. And I will ask you to just explain that a bit. But what are the consequences of actually placing the catheter in the wrong position
So
and the drugs are delivered to the wrong location?
yes, so there are a lot of complications that could happen. I think the one that I talked about was cardiac tamponade, where sort of if the drugs are toxic, and if
Yeah.
they sort of if the line migrates or the tip migrates deep into the heart, it can start pumping the drugs not even inside the heart, but on the outer layers of the heart, and it could start inflating it. That could be dangerous because
Right.
it could impair the heart's function, or anything else. It may even require surgery to fix. Don't quote me on that. I need to confirm that, but it actually can get quite dangerous. The other one could be if it gets too low, it
Yeah.
may start delivering
Absolutely.
toxic drugs in the liver, or some of the portions of the body underneath the heart
Right.
that are not suitable for those kind of toxic drugs. So that's another complication that could come out of it.
From the cost benefit perspective of this device that you guys are effectively developing, just removing those complications could actually be a cost saving to the hospital itself because there's no additional treatment or anything required for the patient itself as a starting point. How did you come up with what the solution was? How does the actual device actually work?
Yes, so it was an interesting process because it just goes back to our biodesign days, right? So the biodesign process it follows something called a double diamond approach. So you start with zero problems, but then you sort of go towards this divergent thinking where you come up with a list of problems, and then you sort of pick one problem and you sort of create the first diamond. So that's your problem. This is where you get your problem statement and the need statement, right? So we got that need statement to that process. But then there's another diamond that I hadn't talked about before, which is basically how do you come up with a solution? Well, you brainstorm a bunch of solution. Again, another sort of stage of divergent thinking. You come up with a bunch of solution, and then again use a bit of a criteria to figure out which solution might be the best, and then you sort of converge to one solution. In our case, we came up when we did the brainstorming, the idea was that you start with a bunch of ideas. It can be any idea, it can be a crazy idea, doesn't matter. And then you sort of start filtering them down to something that's achievable. You use a criteria. The criteria could be what would be the regulatory burden, or what would be the potential regulatory burden, the technical burden, how accurately would this solve the problem? Are the users going to like the form factor that would come out of that solution? But anyways, in for this particular case, what actually ended up happening was that we found this technique in a lot of research papers that haven't been utilized for newborn babies and older children. It's called a ECG-based duplication technique, where what happens is that there's a way to actually make the catheter a conductive probe, and as the conductive probe moves
Right.
closer to the heart, the signals get stronger. And then if you're able to read those signals, you can use that to, determine the duplication. Now, there was a bunch of research done on it, but not enough for you to know what these signals are exactly for different locations. So what we did then was we did a bunch of studies at the Royal Women's Hospital where we collected a bunch of data, labeled them with X-rays, which is the standard of care. And we sort of then learned, okay, so these are the bunch of ECG waveforms, and these are the bunch of X-rays, and that's how they correlate. We found patterns. And then we went ahead and sort of developed a device that automatically reads those patterns, or understands those patterns, so that the next time they get a pattern like that when they're doing a procedure, it would tell you which sort of pattern it matches in terms of the location.
Absolutely. That makes perfect sense. So effectively, if I was to summarize it for the layman's out there, people like me, for example, you found some research that you could effectively use an ECG to determine the location of where the tip is, but the feedback effectively you got, it doesn't necessarily give you the information you need to know where the location is. So you just went through an iterative process where you got a heap of data through the women's hospital, and you were able to use that information to actually paint a picture of where the actual location of where that tip is. And how long did that process take to actually go through the data and do those studies and everything like that? Because we're talking, you started in 2016, you've ideated, you've come up with a problem. How long then to actually come to to get the data sets?
Well, clinical studies in general takes a lot of time.
Yep.
That's like one of the challenges of the medical device industry, because you got to go through a bunch of approvals, and they're not just, technical approvals. They're also ethics approvals. They're also research approvals.
Absolutely.
And then you have to sort of set up an agreement with the hospitals that you're working with. So there's a bunch of things you have to do, bunch of logistics, and each approval has its own timeline, right? And it can vary a lot. But I think we did about 2 studies at the Women's Hospital, both for different purposes, both with different equipment. But the end goal was to actually collect that data. And I think we recruited about 130 participants, and it took us so we did the first one in 2018. So, and the second one was finished in 2022. So about 4 years.
Right. And that's during a pandemic as well.
Yeah, the pandemic
How
sort of
did that?
delayed it
Yeah, I was gonna.
massively.
How did that complicate it?
It delayed it massively, and we're doing a third study
Absolutely.
at the moment. And we got approvals last year, but there were a few other approvals that had to follow through, and they took some time. So we just started recruiting for that, and our wonderful chief medical officer has been at it since yesterday to recruit more and more patients. But it's a recent study that's going on at the Women's Hospital as well.
That's great news. And so you effectively conducted a couple of years of studies just to collect the data that you need to be able to actually work out what that picture looks like. And you've had to do it during a pandemic out of all these processes as well. Do you have a bit of an insight about, like, this stuff isn't cheap, and this is what I know about startups. They always need cash. In terms of being able to raise money, how was that able to be done? I know you won a few grants along the way. So you won a Victorian grant and effectively a federal government grant as well. But what was that process? What was that like in the actual incubator itself? Like, you're stuck in that incubator, trying to raise money while you're actually kind of trying to be, I describe it as you're building the plane as you're trying to fly it.
Yeah, it is exactly like that. It's that classic chicken and egg problem. You
Yeah,
need the money to do research, but then you need the research to do to get the money.
Yeah,
It was
correct.
yeah. So what ends up happening generally with startups is that it's like a step-by-step approach. So initially, when you have no funds, or you have some funds that you put from your own pocket, or you use your friends and family to get those funds, you get those funds and you sort of try to achieve some work through that. So it may be an early proof of concept, maybe a quick animal study, maybe a benchtop study. You can quickly create a business plan and you use that to sort of get certain milestones done, and then you start going to the investor and say, this is the work that I've done. You go to the pitch competitions and say, this is the work that I've done, and that sort of, if you're successful in that, that sort of gives you a nice boost, and then you get to that step phase again, because now you have the money and now you have to spend it and get the next set of milestones done so that you can go one step up and raise more money. As you're going up, um, you're you're giving away more equity, but at the same time, the value of your company is going up as well, because you're doing
Absolutely.
more and more, work
Hmm.
towards the company. So you may start with a benchtop study, but then you go up to an animal study, then you do a clinical study, and as you can see that the value of your company is going up because you have done so much to show that this is a valuable problem to be solved, and it's a viable solution and all that. At the same time, the risk profile sort of starts going down. So at the start, your
Absolutely.
company is very risky. No one would want to invest until, unless, it's you or, some of your friends who believe in you. But then as soon as, you start achieving those milestones, you go one step down and, the risk from the company gets taken out and so on and so forth, for further rounds. Now, it has been
That,
quite
that
hard raising funds. And our CEO has done an excellent job in raising a lot of funds, and the team and our COO with the grants and everything. But I think the point I was going to make was that there have been some accelerator programs that we have joined in Australia and overseas that have
yep.
actually accelerated that pathway for us by providing us with the right networks, access to the right people, access to the right expertise, and then that has massively helped us to move that journey and grow it quicker.
That's actually the key point. So when you're first starting off, it's super high risk, kind of just to get to that first milestone. But when you do put in the hard work and the effort, and you go through a pandemic, and nothing's guaranteed. This is the other thing too. Nothing's guaranteed. You get over that first hurdle, and then sort of a bigger door opens up, if that makes sense, and then that gives you a little bit more opportunity to get to the next stage. So you sort of iterate and go through that process. Now, were there any big hurdles that you faced during that process as well?
Um, there were a lot of hurdles, so I could say
Minus
that,
the pandemic.
yeah, I mean every domain in the company has its own hurdle, right? So, um, for example, the clinical had its own hurdle. I talked about the clinical challenge. It takes a very long time to set up studies and recruit patients. Clinical had that hurdle. The hurdles that product had was around, getting the right accuracy, getting the right parts sorted, and all that. Um, I think the biggest hurdle at the moment that we're facing with fundraising, and I'm not talking about grants, but in general, that because the inflation is so high, people have become more risk averse, and no one is really putting the money
Absolutely.
out there. They're calling it the winter. And if you've seen Game of Thrones, you know what I mean. I think from the in the last 2 years, they have been saying that winter is coming, and now the winter has come.
Yeah,
It's cold, plus at the same time, people aren't really putting any money. So, like I
absolutely.
said, every domain has its own challenges. The regulatory domain had its own challenge. You got to figure out what the regulators want, and then you try to work towards that. Luckily, because we're talking to the FDA in the US, FDA has been super helpful in sort of helping us figure out that regulatory pathway. They have this um, pathway called pre-submission meeting where you have the opportunity to actually talk to them and get their thoughts on things. So that has been super helpful. But like I said, every domain has its own challenge, and we're trying to navigate through that.
Absolutely. And especially in the current market right now, I know I work for a startup myself. Um, it's hard to raise. Hard to raise capital. They all need capital. It's hard to raise capital because effectively it's really hard for people to spend money now in a market where they see sort of the stock market's kind of going like this, and it's all sentiment. So as one thing goes, then everyone sort of pulls back their investment, and it's really hard, and it's a challenge. So just for anyone out there who wants to start a business to become a multi-billionaire overnight, it's really not like that. There is a lot of challenges, and Mubin, you're a classic example of that startup where you've got something and it's slowly growing, it's growing, but then now you're coming into that that investment winter. And this is where you've got to really tighten everything down. You've got to get your product value. You've got to get everything right to be able to raise that next bit of capital to get that next development done. Now, tell me a little bit about one of the great things that happened. What happened to this breakthrough designation with the product with the FDA?
Yeah,
When did that
yes.
happen?
It was quite recent. I think it was a few months ago. So breakthrough device designation is sort of FDA's way of saying that whatever you're doing, we want it in the market soon, right? And we're going to
Perfect.
throw every resource at it to help you as much as you can. So remember I talked about the pre-submission pathway before?
Yep.
So the pre-submission pathway actually typically takes about 3 to 4 months for you to actually get in touch with FDA and get their feedback. But with the breakthrough device designation, that sort of gets accelerated, and you have more opportunities to talk to FDA at more points. So that's super helpful. Um, yeah, it's. I mean, it's. I think that the reason that we were able to get breakthrough device designation is that FDA recognized that the problem that we're trying to solve is sort of, urgent, and there's a need for this kind of device, especially because it's catering to the newborn and the pediatric population. So FDA is very supportive of innovations that are coming in the pediatric space and the newborn space, to the point that they have actually waived their fee if there's a pediatric or newborn or neonatal submission. So and personal experience with FD has been that they're very open to um, different things. Like they have their regulatory laws and principles, but when you try to explain them, they're more receptive because they want to support innovation in this area. But yeah, that's breakthrough for us at the moment.
We'll wrap up this meeting pretty soon because it's already over the 1 hour mark. But what's next? What happens next? So you've got that breakthrough designation. I believe you get allocated your own account manager, kind of. You get a accelerated pathway to actual approval as well. What's next?
I guess from a regulatory point of view, what's next is basically us setting up some meetings with FDA and getting feedback on different things. And that's where the breakthrough is going to be super helpful because the window of feedback will be less. But from a company point of view in general, we're in a very in what you would call a crunch period. When I say crunch, it's
Yeah.
everything is happening at the same time. So we have multiple studies up and running, or either up and running or in the approval phase at the women's hospital, at the children's hospital, and we're trying to collect as much as data as we can and trying to prove that the device works as well. We have recently, or we're about to finish the next iteration of the product, which we're calling the alpha prototype, and it will be ready to be tested in one of the studies that I talked about. Um, in that study, we just want to make sure that it works as good as we claim it to be. Um, Once it does
Yep.
that, we'll use those learnings and create the final sort of prototype and do what we call a validation or a pivotal study. The pivotal or validation study is a study where you collect data specifically for regulatory bodies. So we want to collect, like we want to do a really good study design. We want to follow all the GCP principles. It's not that we're not following them now, but the reporting requirements becomes a lot more rigorous. So we want to do that and submit that data to the FDA hopefully next year or the
Yep.
year after and use that as a way to get a regulatory approval.
That's exceptional, and that's some great. That's actually a great process that you're in right now. I know it's crunch time, and it's really really hard where everything's happening at the same time. But it almost feels like you're almost towards that end of that next phase to be able to do that next study. So that's some great news. Now, I'll lead off on this final note as well. What happens next once you do get FDA approval? Does it become easier to get approval in other countries as well? So like Australia, Singapore, the UK, everything like that, or do they again all have their own separate, different processes that you need to go through as well?
Yeah, depends. So Australia, for example, recognizes FDA approval, but you need to do other things alongside it. So there's a pathway called
Right.
MDSAP pathway, where you
Yep.
need to have a medical device ISO certified. It's called ISO 13485 certified system in your company, and the MDSAP pathway sort of assesses that. So you get the FDA approval, and then you get the MDSAP certified certificate, and then you can come to Australia and get an approval. For New Zealand, for example, you can get an FDA approval and then you can get an approval directly. So it really depends on where you're going. But I think for us, the primary market is the US. Once we have
Yeah.
gotten a regulatory approval, we do want to do a sort of a controlled release and distribute it to some of the hospitals that are friendly to us and have them try it before we start to distribute it widely. Um, but yeah, that's the main the primary market for
Perfect,
us.
perfect, and that's a great story. Like you've got a goal. You see it. There's a light at the end of that tunnel, and I know it's crunch time, and it's coming down fast. I do want to be respectful of your time. We have gone over the hour mark. Mubin, I'd like to thank you for coming on the podcast. You are my fourth guest. You've got an incredible story. You've gone through a path of resilience, and then you've started your own startup. So I would say you jumped out of the pot, you jumped into the fire, and you guys have done really well. And I've been following you guys on LinkedIn. Now, just a couple of things. I will send you an email for all your LinkedIn and everything. How do people help you out? How do they get in contact with what you guys are doing? How do they support what you're doing? What's the best way for people to support what you're doing?
There is a contact us page on our website. So our website is
Yep.
navitechnologies.com. People can
Yep.
use that contact us form to contact us, or you can just use info@navitechnologies.com as a way to send us an email if you want. We're always looking for, well, I wouldn't say funds at this stage, but we're always looking for any sort of support. If you know anyone in sort of the neonatal domain or the pediatric domain that might be interested in a device like this, please tell them about us. Or if you are one of
Absolutely.
those person, please reach out to us. Yeah.
And if you're in those industries, if you check out the link below this video, I'm going to have all the links to getting contact with everybody at Navi. So all the links will be there. Are you on any social media, Twitter, Facebook, anything like that? Apart from LinkedIn, I'll have your LinkedIn page on there as well.
So Navi, I think we just use LinkedIn as a primary social media.
Perfect. Okay, so I'll have all the links below this video so everyone can get access to that. Mubin, thank you so much for your time. Before everyone leaves, I do ask them one thing. Do you have any parting comments, or is there any sort of information that you think that we didn't cover off, and it's something you'd like to express before we sort of wrap up this interview?
Hmm. I think you've covered pretty much everything, but if I were to give a parting advice, is that,
Yeah.
well,
What is it?
I think if you're trying to start a company in Australia, especially in Victoria, there's a lot of support out there. So
Yep.
if you have doubts going in your head around fundraising and other stuff, I would say that the government is really, really trying to beef up, at least especially the medical device sector. So I would say that,
Yep.
don't get scared by all the scary stuff out there which I talked about. Give it a try. There's a lot of programs out there that are helping startups grow. Like I said, there are a lot of accelerator and incubator programs that have helped us, and they can help other companies as well. And look, if you need any advice or help from us, we're always available. I think, Taraka, you will share the links. Send me an email if you need any help.
Absolutely.
But yeah, don't be scared. I mean, at this stage, that's the only thing I could think of from the top of my head.
Naveen, that's some great advice, and you've done great things in Australia, and what you guys are doing at Navi is incredible. And at the end of the day, it's going to save lives. It's gonna it's going to save lives in less treatments for people through complications, and just better access to better medical care for everyone. So thank you for everything you've done. Thank you so much for your time. I'll be following everything you guys are doing. And once you do get that FDA approval, I might have you back on just to walk us through that.
Yep, sounds good. Happy to help.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Mubin, and you have a great day.
You too.
Okay, guys, so I hope you got a lot of value out of that interview. Now, if you've got a job interview coming up, or you're preparing for a job interview process, check out the link below. It's my free course on how to prepare for any job interviews. We go through the key things that knock people out all the time: fashion and hygiene. What are the common questions you're likely to be asked? What questions do you need to prepare for? And critically, what do you do if you've started applying for jobs and you've got missed calls from recruiters? Now, those are screening calls, and you have to pass those in order to get through the next stage. So if you want access to all of that, please check out the link below. Like always, best of luck with your career.